I found your wallet, sir.
The words came from an 8-year-old girl standing in a CEO's office, her old sneakers squeaking against the marble floor. In her small hands was $1,000, enough to save her mother from eviction, enough to change everything. But Lucia Cruz, called Lulu, made a choice that day at a hot bus stop in East Austin. A choice that would uncover secrets, test forgiveness, and remind a powerful man what truly matters. Welcome to Golden Heart Stories. This is the story of an 8-year-old girl whose simple act of honesty would change the lives of everyone it touched. The August sun hammered down on the cracked asphalt of East Austin, turning the air into something thick and suffocating. At the bus stop on 7th Street, where the metal bench had grown too hot to touch, 8-year-old Lucia Cruz stood waiting with her mother. Everyone called her Lulu, a name that seemed too bright for a girl whose eyes already understood hardship. Her faded pink backpack hung from one shoulder, the zipper broken months ago and never replaced. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she watched the heat shimmer rise from the pavement like invisible ghosts. Her mother Elena sat beside her, eyes half closed from exhaustion, still wearing the coffee-stained uniform from her morning shift at the diner. The fabric clung to her skin, damp with perspiration and the lingering smell of grease. Elena's hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced as if in silent prayer, though Lulu knew her mother was simply too tired to move them. The bus was late again, and the minutes stretched like hours. It was then that Lulu noticed something wedged beneath the bench, partially hidden by an empty soda can. A brown leather wallet, its edges worn smooth by time and use. Her heart quickened as she bent down and retrieved it, the leather warm against her small palms. She glanced at her mother, whose eyes remained closed, and carefully opened it. Inside, crisp bills were folded neatly, more money than Lulu had ever seen in one place. She counted them twice with trembling fingers. $1,000. Tucked behind the cash was a business card, with elegant lettering that read, Henry Caldwell, SIG Headquarters, followed by a phone number she memorized instantly. Lulu's mind raced through possibilities that an 8-year-old shouldn't have to consider. This money could pay their rent that was already 2 weeks overdue. It could fix the air conditioner that had been broken since June, turning their apartment into an oven every night. It could buy her mother a day off, maybe 2. The weight of the wallet seemed to grow heavier in her hands, as if it contained not just paper and leather, but the burden of a decision that would define who she was. Elena's eyes opened slowly, focusing on her daughter's frozen expression, and the wallet clutched in her hands. For a moment, mother and daughter simply looked at each other. An entire conversation happening in silence. Elena reached out and gently touched Lulu's cheek, her calloused fingers tender despite their roughness. When she spoke, her voice carried the weariness of someone who had fought too many battles, but refused to surrender her soul. Honesty is a luxury, mija, but one worth keeping. The words settled over Lulu like a blessing and a burden all at once. She looked down at the wallet again, at the money that could change everything, and the name that belonged to someone who was probably searching for it right now. Her small fingers closed around it more tightly, not with greed but with resolve. She nodded slowly, and in that gesture, something shifted inside her. The decision had been made. They would return it. They would do the right thing, even when the wrong thing would have been so much easier. Even when hunger and heat and unpaid bills whispered that survival mattered more than virtue. The bus finally arrived, its brakes hissing like a tired sigh. As they climbed aboard, Lulu tucked the wallet carefully into her backpack, protecting it as if it were something sacred. Through the smudged window, she watched the bus stop disappear behind them, and wondered about the man named Henry Caldwell, who had no idea that his lost wallet was about to change more lives than just his own. The Caldwell Infrastructure Group tower rose from downtown Austin like a monument to ambition, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun. Lulu stood at the base, neck craned back so far it hurt. The wallet felt like a stone in her backpack, growing heavier with each step toward the revolving doors. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floor, making her feel small. The receptionist desk stretched before her like a judge's bench. Behind it sat Catherine Ross, a woman in her early 30s whose crisp white blouse spoke of precision. Catherine was reviewing schedules when she noticed the small figure approaching. Lulu's hand trembled as she reached into her backpack, fingers fumbling with the zipper. When she pulled out the wallet and placed it on the counter, the leather made a soft sound. Catherine's eyes widened at the initials embossed on the corner. She leaned forward, studying the child. Lulu's voice came out smaller than intended. "I found this. It belongs to Mr. Henry Caldwell. I want to give it back." The sincerity in those words struck something deep in Catherine's professional armor. She had worked here 6 years, seen countless people pass through chasing money or favor, but never anything like this. A child in shoes too small, returning a wallet that probably held more than her family saw in months. Catherine's expression softened, the corners of her eyes crinkling with something like hope. She picked up her phone and spoke in hushed tones, eyes never leaving Lulu's face. Minutes passed like hours. Lulu shifted her weight from foot to foot, heart hammering loudly. Finally, Catherine stood and gestured toward the elevators with a gentle smile. "Mr. Henry will see you now. Come with me." The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt like ascending into another world. When the doors opened, they walked through corridors lined with photographs of bridges and highways. At the end of the hall stood an open door, and through it Lulu could see a man by the window, hands clasped as he surveyed the city. Henry Caldwell turned as they entered, face showing mild curiosity. He was tall, in his late 50s, hair silver at the temples, suit impeccable. He assumed she was a delivery girl running an errand. But when Lulu stepped forward, hands trembling as she extended the wallet, something in her calm voice and steady gaze made him pause. "I found your wallet, sir. I wanted to make sure you got it back." Henry took the wallet from her small hands, fingers brushing hers for just a moment. He opened it, saw the money still folded inside, untouched, and looked back at her with new eyes. The distance in his expression crumbled, replaced by something raw. He studied her face, the way her chin lifted despite nervousness, the dignity in her posture that seemed borrowed from someone older. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply holding the wallet and looking at this child who had reminded him that integrity still existed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old silver coin, worn smooth by time, a keepsake carried for decades. He pressed it into Lulu's palm, closing her fingers around it gently. His voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you, truly." As Lulu turned to leave with Catherine, Henry stood watching her go, his eyes filled with curiosity that had been absent from his life for far too long. Something in him had shifted, awakened by a single act of simple honesty from a child who had every reason to keep what she found but chose otherwise. The door closed behind her, but the echo of her presence remained, changing the air in the room like the first breath after a long silence. Elena Cruz's life unfolded in the spaces between exhaustion and survival, measured in minutes she stole from sleep to pay bills that never stopped arriving. Their apartment on Rosewood Avenue sat on the second floor of a building that had seen better decades, its paint peeling. Like sunburned skin and wooden stairs groaning with every footstep. The mailbox overflowed with envelopes stamped in red ink, each one a reminder of what she owed and could not pay. She sorted through them at the kitchen table after her double shift, her fingers moving slowly, mechanically, as if weighted by the numbers inside. The air conditioner had been broken since June, leaving the apartment thick with stale heat. Elena had learned to move through the rooms like a ghost, conserving energy, her body understanding what her mind refused to accept. She kept the windows open at night, hoping for a breeze that rarely came. And fell asleep to the sound of their neighbor's television blaring through the thin walls. Sitcom laughter and commercials became the soundtrack to her insomnia, punctuated by occasional arguments from below. Her hands told the story her voice could not. They were the hands of someone who had scrubbed too many dishes, carried too many trays, worked too many hours for too little pay. The skin was cracked at the knuckles, nails cut short and practical, calluses thick as armor. When she looked at them in the dim kitchen light, she saw her mother's hands, and her grandmother's before that. An inheritance of struggle passed down like a family heirloom. Yet there remained something dignified in those hands, something that refused to be broken by circumstance. Every night, Elena sat on the edge of Lulu's narrow bed and told her stories. Not fairy tales from books they could not afford. but stories she invented from memory and imagination, tales of brave girls who faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. Her voice was soft and rhythmic, a lullaby woven from words, designed to drown out the neighbors' television that shook their shared wall. Lulu listened with eyes half closed, small hand wrapped around her mother's calloused fingers, finding comfort in the sound more than the substance. The next afternoon, as Elena stood at the stove heating water for instant coffee, the phone rang. It was an old landline she kept because cell service was too expensive, its cord tangled from years of use. She answered absently, expecting a bill collector or wrong number, but the voice on the other end made her freeze. "Mrs. Cruz? This is Henry Caldwell. I wanted to thank you and your daughter personally for returning my wallet. Would it be possible for me to visit you?" Elena's grip tightened on the receiver, knuckles going white. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind in a breath. Men like Henry Caldwell did not visit apartments like hers. People with money and power did not knock on doors in neighborhoods where hope came in small increments. Her first instinct was to refuse, to protect what little pride remained, but something in his voice stopped her. It carried a sincerity that felt genuine, a warmth that seemed unscripted. She glanced at Lulu, who sat at the table doing homework with a pencil worn to a stub, and found herself nodding even though he could not see her. "Yes, you can come." When she hung up, her hand remained on the phone for a long moment, as if anchoring herself to something solid. The weight of the conversation settled over her like a blanket, heavy with possibility and dread in equal measure. She did not know what to expect, but she knew that something had shifted, that the life she had accepted as permanent might not be as fixed as she had believed. Outside the window, the sun began its descent, painting Rosewood Avenue in shades of amber and shadow, and Elena stood in her small kitchen, wondering if she had just opened a door she could never close again. Henry Caldwell arrived at Rosewood Avenue driving a modest sedan rather than his usual luxury car. Understanding that wealth could intimidate as easily as impress, he parked where children played and old men sat on stoops, their eyes following him with curiosity and suspicion. The building stood weathered but not broken, its facade telling stories of families who had scraped by for generations. He climbed the stairs slowly, his hand on the wobbling railing, and knocked on apartment 2B with uncharacteristic nervousness. Elena opened the door wearing her best dress, a simple blue cotton garment reserved for church and emergencies. Her hair pulled back in a neat bun that revealed the tiredness around her eyes. She had cleaned the apartment until her arms ached. The living room smelled of lemon cleaner and rice cooked for dinner. She studied Henry's face as he entered, searching for signs of pity or condescension, but found instead something that looked like genuine respect. Henry stood in the small room, taking in details that spoke volumes. The furniture was old but carefully maintained, cushions worn smooth but clean and arranged with dignity. A small bookshelf held library books marked with due date stamps, evidence of Lulu's hunger for stories they could not afford. On the wall hung a framed photograph of Elena and Lulu at Zilker Park, their smiles bright against green grass and blue sky. He understood immediately that this was not a home of carelessness or defeat, but of people fighting with grace. He did not reveal himself as CEO, instead introducing himself simply as someone grateful for their honesty. The lie felt necessary, a way to observe without distortion. He spoke quietly, his voice stripped of its usual authority, explaining that his company had an opening in the maintenance division if Elena was interested. The words hung heavy between them. Elena's first instinct was to refuse. Pride rose in her throat like bile, the assumption that this was charity wrapped in thin disguise. Her jaw tightened and shoulders squared, preparing for polite rejection. But then Lulu appeared from the bedroom, her small face serious beyond her years. The girl walked to her mother's side and placed a hand on Elena's arm, her touch gentle but insistent. When she spoke, her voice carried wisdom borrowed from somewhere ancient. "Maybe God sent him, Mama." The simplicity of those words shattered Elena's resistance like glass struck by a hammer. She looked down at her daughter, saw the hope shining in those dark eyes, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was not surrender but acceptance, the recognition that sometimes help came in unexpected forms and refusing it was not strength but foolish pride. She turned back to Henry, her expression still guarded but softening, and allowed herself to nod slowly. I'll take the job, thank you. Henry felt the weight lift from his shoulders, a burden he had not known he was carrying. He had expected suspicion or gratitude, but what he saw in Alina's face was neither. It was determination, the resolve of someone who understood that this was not a gift but an opportunity requiring every ounce of strength she possessed. As he turned to leave, making his way back down the groaning stairs and out into the evening air, something in his face softened visibly. The emotional armor he had worn for decades showed its first crack. He sat in his car for a long moment before starting the engine, his hands resting on the steering wheel, and allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in years. It was something closer to kinship, the recognition that dignity existed in places he had forgotten to look. Alina's first day at Caldwell Infrastructure Group began in pre-dawn darkness, her alarm screaming at 4:30 in the morning. She dressed carefully in the maintenance uniform they had provided, the fabric stiff and new against her skin, smelling of possibility. Her hands trembled as she buttoned the shirt, not from fear but from the weight of what this opportunity meant. Lulu watched from the doorway, still in pajamas, eyes heavy with sleep but bright with pride. They did not speak, but Alina kissed her daughter's forehead before leaving, a benediction and promise wrapped in that gesture. The maintenance division occupied the lower floors, a world away from the glass and chrome offices above. The room hummed with machinery and voices, men and women in matching uniforms who looked up briefly when she entered. Alina felt their stares like touches on her skin, the weight of judgment pressing against her. She kept her chin up and eyes forward, refusing to shrink under scrutiny, carrying herself with the same dignity she brought to every corner of her life. The work was harder than anything she had done at the diner. Her supervisor Marcus, a man with kind eyes and calloused hands, showed her how to check data logs for the building's systems, endless columns of numbers tracking everything from water pressure to electrical load. The computer screen glowed harsh and unforgiving, and Alina's eyes burned as she squinted at figures that seemed to swim. But she learned quickly, her mind sharp despite limited formal education, catching patterns others might have missed. By mid-morning, her hands had developed fresh blisters from tools she was still learning to hold properly. During the afternoon review, she caught her first error, a small discrepancy in the cooling system logs that someone else had overlooked. She brought it to Marcus with hesitation, expecting to be told she was mistaken. But Marcus studied the numbers, his finger tracing the columns, and then nodded slowly with something that looked like respect. He made the correction without fanfare, but word spread through the division the way news always travels among workers. By the end of her shift, the stares had changed quality, no longer purely suspicious but tinged with cautious acknowledgement. What Alina did not know was that Henry watched from a distance, his presence that day no accident. He stood in the observation room overlooking the maintenance floor, hidden behind tinted glass. He watched her double-check every entry, saw the way she asked questions without shame. Noticed how she earned small nods of approval through sheer competence and quiet determination. Pride swelled in his chest, an unfamiliar emotion that sat uncomfortable and warm beneath his ribs. He was careful to stay anonymous, knowing his identity as CEO would taint her accomplishment with suggestions of favoritism. That evening, Alina returned to Rosewood Avenue walking taller than she had in years, despite exhaustion that made her legs feel like lead and her back ache. The apartment felt different somehow, as if the walls themselves had expanded to accommodate new possibilities. She cooked dinner with Lulu beside her, and they ate together at the small table that wobbled on uneven legs. The meal was simple, beans and rice and tortillas warmed on the stove, but it tasted like celebration. Lulu talked about her day at school while Alina listened with eyes that saw her daughter more clearly than ever before. Understanding now what it meant to give a child not just love but the example of perseverance rewarded. As they cleaned dishes together, Alina felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. It was hope, fragile and tentative as a seedling pushing through concrete, but undeniably present. The job was not salvation, not yet, but it was a beginning. Thomas Blake had built his career on merit and meticulous attention to detail, climbing through Caldwell Infrastructure Group's ranks over 15 years until he reached senior vice president. He was a man in his early 50s whose tailored suits and polished shoes spoke of success earned through countless nights reviewing contracts. His 14th floor office overlooked the city, a view he had once considered proof of his worth, but lately something had begun to corrode that satisfaction. It started with small observations that accumulated like sediment. Henry Caldwell had always been fair but distant, treating all employees with professional courtesy. But in recent weeks, Thomas noticed unusual changes. Henry made unexpected visits to the maintenance division, a place he had rarely ventured. He inquired about Elena Cruz specifically, asking questions that carried more weight than casual interest. Thomas watched as Henry stood in the observation room looking down at the maintenance floor. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested more than professional oversight. The favoritism was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent years reading corporate politics. Thomas felt something dark begin to twist in his chest. A resentment he recognized from other times when rules seemed to bend for others while remaining rigid for him. He told himself he was protecting the company's integrity, maintaining standards that could not be compromised by personal sentiment. But beneath those justifications lived something uglier. It was envy mixed with indignation, the bitter taste of watching someone receive opportunities that appeared unearned. He began his campaign carefully, with practiced subtlety. The maintenance division used a shared database for tracking building operations, and Thomas had security clearance to access those files. Late one evening, after most employees had gone home, he sat at his computer and opened Elena's work logs. The screen cast cold blue light across his face as his fingers moved across the keyboard, changing numbers here, altering timestamps there. Creating a pattern that would suggest negligence without triggering immediate suspicion. He modified temperature readings to fall outside acceptable ranges, backdated maintenance checks to make them appear overdue, and introduced small errors into Elena's entries that would paint carelessness. Each keystroke felt justified in his mind, a correction of an imbalance that should never have existed. He saved the changes and logged out, erasing his digital footprints. When he finally left the building, the city lights below seemed to blur together into a sea of judgment he refused to acknowledge. The effects manifested within days. Elena was called into meetings where supervisors questioned her about discrepancies she could not explain. She pulled up her entries only to find them different from what she remembered, her confidence shaken by evidence that contradicted her memory. Marcus looked at her with confusion rather than respect, and whispered conversations among coworkers took on a different tone. The stares returned, but now they carried suspicion rather than acknowledgement, and Elena felt the ground beneath her feet becoming unstable. The office itself seemed to respond to the corruption growing within its walls. Fluorescent lights flickered in hallways as if struggling against invisible darkness. Colleagues who had begun to warm to Elena now avoided her gaze, turning away when she approached. Gossip spread through the maintenance division like smoke, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. The mounting unease was tangible, pressure building in the air like humidity before a storm, and Elena moved through it with her head high. But her heart heavy, knowing something had shifted but unable to understand why or how to fight shadows she could not see. Elena stayed late on a Thursday evening when the building had emptied, leaving behind only the hum of machinery and the ghostly glow of exit signs. She could not bear another day of watching her reputation crumble beneath accusations she could not defend. Her fingers trembled as she logged into the maintenance database, determination warring with exhaustion. Daniel Park, the IT officer, found her there at 7:30, hunched over her computer screen. He was a quiet man in his late 20s who wore thick-framed glasses and spoke in careful measured tones. He pulled up a chair beside her, and together they began to trace the audit logs that tracked every database change. The work was painstaking and required technical knowledge Elena did not possess, but Daniel's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced confidence. He explained as he worked, showing her how each entry contained hidden metadata recording not just what was changed but who had made the change and when. The timestamps began to reveal a pattern that made Elena's breath catch, a trail of modifications made late at night when she had been home with Lulu. Made by an access code belonging to someone with senior-level clearance. It was Daniel who spoke the name first, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Thomas Blake, Senior Vice President. He's been accessing your files for the past 3 weeks. Elena stared at the screen, at the irrefutable evidence that proved her innocence and someone else's guilt. The relief should have been overwhelming, but instead she felt something closer to betrayal, understanding that someone with power had chosen to destroy her. Not because of anything she had done, but simply because her existence had threatened his sense of order. Her hands clenched into fists, knuckles white with emotions she did not have words to name. It was in that moment that Henry Caldwell appeared in the doorway, startling them both. He had been working late when he noticed lights still on in a section that should have been dark. Elena looked up at him, and in that exchange something shifted. She had believed him to be simply a grateful stranger, but the way Daniel straightened and the sudden formality in his voice revealed the truth. "Mr. Caldwell, sir, we've discovered something you need to see." The title hung in the air, heavy with implications. Elena's eyes widened as understanding crashed over her, the realization that Henry Caldwell was not just an employee, but the CEO of the entire company, the man whose name was on the building. The betrayal she felt was different from what Thomas Blake had inflicted, not malicious but perhaps more painful for its kindness. Henry had hidden his identity, had watched her from a distance, had orchestrated her employment without revealing the full scope of his involvement. Henry's face reflected complex emotions as he met her gaze. There was guilt there, clear and undeniable, but also something that looked like respect and perhaps the beginnings of an apology. He stepped into the room and looked at the screen Daniel indicated, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the evidence of Blake's manipulation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried authority tempered by something more human. "I hid my position because I wanted to see if you could succeed on your own merit, without the complication of knowing I was watching. I was wrong to deceive you, but I was not wrong about you." Elena felt grateful and furious in equal measure, torn between the opportunity he had given her and the dishonesty that had shaped it. But underneath those warring emotions lived something steadier, a recognition that they now stood together facing the same truth, preparing silently for a confrontation that would require both of them to choose between justice and mercy. The boardroom on the 20th floor was a space designed for power, with walls of polished wood and a table that stretched like a runway down the center. Morning light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended like witnesses to judgment. Thomas Blake sat at one end, his hands folded before him with a calmness that seemed practiced rather than genuine, while Henry and Elena occupied chairs across from him. Daniel Park stood near a laptop connected to a projector, ready to display the evidence. The documents appeared on the screen, damning and undeniable. Each altered entry was displayed side by side with its original version, timestamps and access codes highlighted in yellow that seemed to glow with accusation. Thomas watched his own corruption laid bare in columns and numbers, watched the architecture of his sabotage dismantled with forensic precision. His face remained composed for a long moment, but then something in him began to crack like ice under pressure. His shoulders sagged first, the rigid posture collapsing into itself. His hands unfolded and spread flat on the table as if searching for something solid to hold onto. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse with emotion. He had kept locked away too long, words tumbling out in a confession that felt equal parts admission and plea. "My mother died 2 years ago. Cancer. The hospital bills were crushing, and I asked for help, asked the company for an advance, for anything. I was told there were no provisions for that kind of assistance, that personal financial hardship was not the company's responsibility." He looked up at Henry with eyes that held both accusation and grief. The resentment of someone who had given years of loyalty and received nothing when he needed it most. His voice cracked as he continued. "And then you gave her a job. Someone who had done nothing, contributed nothing, who walked in off the street and received kindness I was denied. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't accept it." The confession hung in the air, transforming what they had all believed was simple malice into something more complicated and human. Henry's face went pale as understanding settled over him like a weight. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words adequate to the moment, his jaw working soundlessly as memory crashed over him. It was Elena who broke the silence that followed, her voice soft but carrying strength that seemed borrowed from depths none of them had fully recognized. She leaned forward, her eyes on Thomas with an expression that held no triumph in his downfall. What lived in her face instead was something that looked like recognition. Mercy isn't weakness, Mr. Blake. Anger isn't justice. You hurt me because you were hurting, and that doesn't make it right, but maybe it makes it something we can all learn from. Her words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that reached all of them. Henry looked at her with wonder, seeing in her response something he had lost somewhere in his climb to the top. The capacity for compassion in the face of betrayal, the ability to see past punishment to possibility. Thomas stared at Elena as if she had spoken in a language he once knew but had forgotten, his eyes beginning to fill with tears he could no longer control. The fury that Henry had carried into the room, the righteous anger that had driven him to call this meeting, dissolved in the face of Elena's grace. The silence that replaced it was different, not empty, but full of unspoken recalibration. 3 people sitting at a table meant for judgment and finding instead the harder work of understanding. The announcement of Thomas Blake's demotion sent shockwaves through Caldwell Infrastructure Group that rippled outward from the executive floor. The staff had expected termination, perhaps even legal action, the kind of decisive punishment corporations typically wielded. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented. Blake would be demoted to project manager, his salary reduced, his authority stripped, but his employment would continue. The mercy shown seemed almost scandalous. The maintenance division buzzed with whispered conversations that stopped whenever Elena entered a room. Her co-workers looked at her with expressions that mixed confusion and grudging respect. Marcus approached her during the afternoon break, his weathered face creased with wonder, and simply nodded at her without words. A gesture that carried more weight than any speech. It was the company-wide meeting on Friday morning that crystallized the transformation. Henry stood at a podium in the main conference hall, addressing employees who filled the seats and lined the walls. Elena sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, displaying the same quiet dignity she had carried through every trial. When Henry gestured for her to stand, she rose slowly, her movements hesitant but resolute. Elena Cruz reminded me this week what leadership actually means. It's not about wielding power or enforcing consequences. It's about creating space for people to become better than they were, to learn from mistakes rather than be destroyed by them. She has shown more wisdom in her mercy than I have shown in years of making decisions from positions of authority. His voice carried across the room, each word landing with genuine conviction. The staff remained silent, absorbing the implications. Some shifted uncomfortably, unsettled by their CEO's vulnerability. Others leaned forward, drawn by the rare sight of leadership that acknowledged its own limitations. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassed by the praise but unable to deny its truth. The office mood shifted in the days that followed, not dramatically but steadily, like ice melting under spring sun. Conversations in hallways became less guarded. Co-workers who had avoided Elena began to offer small kindnesses, a saved seat at lunch, a shared cup of coffee, gestures that rebuilt trust one interaction at a time. Thomas Blake moved through the building with his head down, no longer radiating entitled confidence but neither completely broken. He was learning humility the hard way, and the staff watched with mixed feelings of sympathy and just as satisfied. Elena's role expanded quietly and officially. Henry offered her a position in the operations department with responsibility for quality control. Recognition of the eye for detail that had first caught errors in the maintenance logs. The salary was modest but stable, enough to move her and Lulu to a better apartment with working air conditioning and windows that locked properly. She accepted with the same grace she had shown in every other moment. But it was the evenings that revealed the deepest change. Elena enrolled in night classes for her accounting license, textbooks spread across the kitchen table after Lulu had gone to bed, her tired eyes scanning columns of numbers that no longer represented survival but possibility. Her hands, still calloused and marked by years of hard labor, turned pages with careful attention. Her dignity remained intact not because circumstances had improved, but because she had proven to herself and everyone watching that circumstances could not diminish what lived at her core. 6 months passed like pages turning in a book that had found its rhythm. The annual company picnic at Zilker Park arrived on a Saturday in early spring, when the grass still held green promise. Families spread blankets under oak trees, and the air filled with children's laughter and music competing for acoustic dominance. Elena stood near the barbecue grills with Lulu at her side, watching as her daughter chased fireflies that had emerged early in the fading afternoon light. The girl had grown taller in these months, her confidence blooming alongside her mother's transformation, no longer the cautious child who had found a wallet at a bus stop, but someone who understood that integrity carried rewards beyond immediate gratification. Elena's hand rested on Lulu's shoulder when she returned, breathless and glowing. Henry Caldwell moved through the gathering with ease that seemed new to him, speaking with employees and families without the formal distance that had once characterized his interactions. He had learned something in these months, a lesson no business school could have provided. But it was the woman who approached from the parking lot, her steps hesitant and expression guarded, who made him freeze mid-conversation and turn with breath caught in his throat. Rachel Caldwell was 32 years old, her father's daughter in the sharpness of her features and intelligence in her eyes, but carrying wounds that 6 years of estrangement had carved deep. She had not responded to his calls or messages in all that time, maintaining silence that spoke of hurts too profound for simple apologies to bridge. Yet here she stood, drawn by something she could not articulate, perhaps the whisper of change that had reached her. Henry walked toward her slowly, as if approaching something fragile. They stood face to face in the shadow of an oak tree. Two people who shared blood and history but had become strangers through accumulated failures to understand each other. The picnic continued around them, but they existed in a bubble where only their broken relationship mattered. It was Elena who noticed their paralysis, who understood instinctively what was happening. She had developed an eye for human pain in all its variations, and she recognized in both father and daughter the same desperate longing wrapped in protective armor. She approached them not with presumption but with quiet confidence. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to build something new instead of guarding the ruins of what broke. Her words fell between them, soft and profound, creating space where vulnerability became possible. Rachel looked at this stranger who seemed to understand what she and her father had been unable to articulate. Henry's eyes filled with gratitude and wonder, seeing in Elena's intervention the same grace she had shown to Thomas Blake. Rachel and Henry began to speak, their words halting at first and then flowing with increasing honesty, years of hurt spilling out in the presence of someone who had demonstrated that repair was possible. Elena stepped back quietly, returning to where Lulu chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. The story closed with an image of simple beauty. Lulu's small hands cupped around a firefly's brief glow, her face illuminated by its light and by joy that was pure. Henry stood near the oak tree with Rachel, the distance between them diminished if not yet fully closed, their conversation continuing in tones too low to hear but unmistakably healing. And Henry, watching it all, whispered words that carried on the evening breeze. One small act of honesty can travel farther than we ever see. The fireflies rose into the darkening sky like wishes made visible. And the world continued turning, forever changed by a child who chose to return a wallet and a woman who chose mercy. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in kindness. Leave a comment, we'd love to hear your thoughts and stories too. And if you'd like to keep walking with us through moments of honesty, forgiveness, and hope, please subscribe and stay connected. Thank you for watching. This has been Golden Heart Stories.